Hello, everybody. Welcome to the ADA compliance webinar. Thank you for attending. We greatly appreciate it. Our goal today is explaining to you and breaking down the Americans with Disabilities Act, its requirements, how it affects your designs, your installations, specifically in regards to drinking fountains and bottle fillers. Okay. Now, keep in mind as I move through the presentation that the requirements that I'm about to cover apply to a lot more than just drinking fountains, of course, and that do keep in mind your own state, local laws, and be sure to adhere to those to ensure that those are ultimately taken into consideration. State and local standards have to be stricter than what's currently in place at the federal level, which is what we're covering today, the federal standard for compliance. Okay, now to introduce ourselves, my name is Justin Dunn. I am the Senior Field Marketing Specialist at Haas. There's my email right there on the presentation. Please feel free to take it, save it. If you have questions, I'm always available to help. Always available is maybe that's a little too loose of a term, but if you reach out to me, I will try to get back to you as quickly as I can with answers and to assist with it, whatever you got going on. With me, sitting in the office behind me, making sure that everything goes smoothly, is Hayden Delgado. If you want to say hi real quick.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today. I'm Hayden Delgado. I'm a field marketing specialist with Haas. And just like Justin said, my email's there on the screen. So if you want to reach out to me with any questions, please feel free to.
Perfect, thank you. And then just to quickly explain, please feel free to post questions at any time during the presentation. We'd love seeing questions. Hayden's going to try to answer them as we progress through the webinar. All of the questions will be saved, and we'll try to answer some at the end of the webinar. If we can't get to all of them, or if we're really tight on time, we can't get to any of them, we'll save them. We'll make an Excel spreadsheet with the questions, answer all of them really thoroughly, and we'll include it in the follow-up materials to the webinar. There are also poll questions throughout the webinar. There's only 5. We didn't get too carried away with those, but they'll be launched throughout the presentation. Your participation, of course, isn't required, but it is greatly appreciated as it allows us to continue to improve and to better understand our audience and your needs and all of that. So if you do participate ahead of time, thank you very much. It's greatly appreciated. Now, we will be sending out a follow-up email about 24 to 48 hours after the presentation, and that's going to include the on-demand recording, presentation slides, additional support materials, useful things for you, and whatever you're trying to accomplish there in your facility, and then CEU instructions as well. ABIH, AIA, ASPE, we'll try to get you those hours, or we can just do certificates of attendance. If you need those, we can provide those as well. So to dive in to the history lesson real quick, and just we always want to start by presenting to everybody why we think we're so uniquely situated to present this information to you in a way that's more easily digestible than just tracking down the standard, going through it, and trying to make heads and tails of stuff. Our founder, Luther Haas, invented the world's first drinking fountain in 1906. He formed the Haas Sanitary Drinking Fountain Company in 1909, Berkeley, California. We have, of course, since moved up to Sparks, Nevada. Luther was working as a sanitation inspector for Berkeley when he had the thought to invent a device that would prevent users from spreading germs and disease through public hydration, which was a big problem. And that device was the drinking fountain bubbler head. You see, pre-Luther and his invention, it was commonplace to see public fountains with constant running water, which isn't that uncommon in the rest of the world today. And it's usually attached or anchored to the fountain is a chain and a cup. And you would pick up that cup, have yourself a drink, and then drop the cup, and the very next person would pick that up and use it, spreading germs and disease. This had obvious public sanitation issues. Today, that's more prevalent than ever. And I don't think I need to explain why that's an issue. I think that's pretty obvious, especially post-pandemic. Lucky for us, Luther got creative and he found a solution that was has continued to benefit us and public health and safety to this day. So with that out of the way, today's agenda, the overview of the ADA, legislation for drinking fountains, common ADA installation issues, ADA compliant drinking fountain and bottle filler installations, right? We don't want to show you the issues without showing you some, people doing it correctly. An ADA FAQ, because we do have some very frequently asked questions. Hayden's going to cover that at the end of the webinar. And then I'll answer some of the questions right after that. And then a hygienic hydration solutions. Some of the solutions that are available today to fill in some of the gaps for ADA compliance, accessibility, and providing clean, touchless hydration solutions. Now, this photo, first and foremost, it's very important for everybody to remember that this is, the ADA is civil rights legislation, okay? Prior to this standard and its inception, accessibility was up to businesses and was infrequently available. There were no teeth in any requirements to provide access to buildings and grounds for an entire class of people that were being very heavily neglected. But thanks to people like Justin Dart, founder of Dart Industries, responsible for a few brands that you would recognize like Duracell, Tupperware, and so on. He was one of the biggest advocates for the movement, and he was often referred to as the grandfather of the ADA, as he himself was disabled. That's him there on the left. And alongside were fellow advocates, and you had Mr. George H.W. Bush, who was the sitting president that signed the Americans with Disabilities Act into law on July 26, 1990. And this was, the new act granted reasonable accommodations to people with disabilities, and it prohibited discrimination based on those disabilities. It's a really cool story, and it would be hard to believe now, hopefully, but they were met with strong resistance to those proposed changes. Protests, counter protests. They had demonstrations like the Capitol Crawl, where they had like 60 demonstrators. They like abandoned their wheelchairs at the steps of the Capitol, crawled up the steps to show how inaccessible the building was. And once they reached the top, demanded to speak to the Speaker of the House. In another instance, while protesting the Transportation Association, police showed up to arrest the protesters, but in a really funny and ironic twist, didn't have accessible vehicles to arrest them with, so they had to obtain accessible school buses to arrest a bunch of wheelchair-bound people. So in their favor, I believe. So there's a little bit of a history lesson. Look into it if you're interested. It's a really powerful, really cool story. So, which is going to bring us to poll question number 1, right before we dig into the ADA requirements. Hayden, if you would launch that, please.
Thank you, Justin. Here's our first poll question today. What are you looking to obtain from this webinar? You can select as many options as apply to you. The options are basic ADA compliance guidance, product recommendations, COVID hygienic solutions and best practices, or CEU credits. I want to thank everyone who participates in these poll questions and encourage you to participate in them as they help us gain a better understanding from this webinar. Give everyone a few more seconds. All right, thank you.
All right, here we go. Americans with Disabilities Act 28 CFR Part 36 Title 3 regarding public accommodations, commercial facilities, and its requirements are enforced by none other than the Department of Justice. Title 3 is going to be our focus today, and following are the key sections of the standard pertaining to drinking fountains and their compliance. Also remember, Hayden is going to send out these slides to everyone after the presentation so that you can reference them later. It'll be in a PDF, so hopefully that'll be helpful. And quickly, since I always get asked, Title II covers state and local government. Title I has more to do with anti-discrimination of disabled employees. Okay. Now, I want to kick this off by starting with section 36.403, which is a list of priorities when making alterations to provide accessibility in a facility. And you're going to notice that in this list, fountains takes a pretty high priority even over accessible parking. So the entrance, route, restrooms, public telephones, fountains, as well as parking, storage, alarms, all high priority items, basic human necessities when navigating the world, all walks of life, all people everywhere. Obviously, we need water. It's right at the top of the list of things we need to survive, and we need to ensure that it is accessible to everyone. Now, Chapter 1, Section 102, just lets us know that this document contains both adult and children's height requirements based on average human anthropometrics, which is just a way of saying measurements and capabilities of the human body. Children are defined as age 12 or younger in the ADA, and I've got examples later on for both adults and children. Now, this section basically explains that where there is one fountain, typically a high side fountain, there must be two fountains. Okay, local building codes determine the number of drinking fountains that need to be installed based on occupancy. This simply states that there must be a high fountain and a low fountain. What most people don't understand is that the low side fountain is not the only fountain that's designed for people with disabilities. The high side fountain is also a disabled accessible fountain, and it's designed for those with bending and stooping disabilities that they may be using a walker, a cane, or crutches, and may not be physically able to utilize the low side fountain. Other than aesthetics, drinking fountains are not designed for able-bodied people because it's reasonable to assume that as an able-bodied person, you can take a drink of whichever fountain you choose. Okay, so where there's a high fountain, there must be a low fountain, one of each. Now, 211.3 kind of goes along with that, and it's referred to as the 50-50 rule to sum this up. And it simply states that half of the units installed need to be high fountains, the other half have to be low fountains. So for example, if you're installing 6 new fountains in a building, you couldn't do 4 high fountains and only 2 low fountains. You have to provide 3 high and 3 low. The exception to this rule is where the number of fountains for the building yields a fraction. So in another example, given the previous requirement, we will assume that you have met the minimum number of drinking fountains for the property and decided to add an additional drinking fountain, giving you 7 total fountains, right? Now the 7th fountain can be either high or low. It's entirely up to you, so long as you have met the 3 high and 3 low fountain to meet the 50-50 rule. Okay, so if you have that fraction, you are the deciding factor on what happens to that odd fountain out. Okay. Now, in chapter 3, we start getting into dimensional and mechanical elements. So you're going to hear me use the term elements a lot throughout the presentation. An element can be any of the devices that we are granting access to. This can be a drinking fountain, phone, fire extinguisher, baby changing table, etc. Any of those types of devices in public. Many of the measurements we're about to go over apply to every single one of these elements, not just drinking fountains, okay? This is one of the most important measurements to remember, one of the easiest to remember as well, and very frequently the section that's being violated in tear-outs. So 305.3, 305.4 detail clear ground space to accommodate the wheelchair underneath the fountain. You have to provide a 30-inch by 48-inch space of clearance underneath the element, which is just larger than your typical adult-sized wheelchair. Giving the users clear space for that wheelchair and for their hands to maneuver the wheelchair into that space, right? Because your hands are on the side, they're controlling the wheels, unless it's an electronic wheelchair. You're manually operating the wheels. So it's important that you have clearance for your hands so that you don't hurt yourself, right? Now, here's an example that clearly demonstrates the clear ground space in front of an element. So in this case, we've got a telephone and we have a fire extinguisher on the left. This just explains that the positioning of this clear ground space, allowing for either a forward approach like the one you see on the left, or a parallel approach as you see the one on the right. Both of those approaches are very important to keep in mind. They're both options, and depending on what it is you're trying to access, you know, one approach may be preferred to another approach, okay? Now keep in mind that 30 by 48 inches, okay, going forward, and this is very frequently the cause for many poor installations. Remember also that these are minimum requirements. The more space you can provide, the better, period. Now, when the element is in the alcove, in an alcove, like the examples above, wheelchair users are going to need additional space to maneuver. Okay, and the clear floor space changes based on the depth of the alcove that you've built. So in our first example, if an alcove is in place, our 30 by 48 inches that was previously acceptable, which would just be like under a wall mounted drinking fountain, you know, we have no alcove in place, that is okay. But that becomes 36 inches by 48 inches when the depth of that alcove exceeds 24 inches. So if it gets deeper, they need more space. So it gets bumped up to 36 by 48. In the second example, for a parallel approach into an alcove, which I bet you can imagine is a little bit more difficult, when the depth of that alcove exceeds 15 inches, our clear floor space has to be bumped up to 30 by 60 inches, obviously wider so they can maneuver in and out of that space easily. Now, currently only 2 states, well, a few states that I'm aware of require the use of alcoves. California is number 1, Texas is the other. However, I'm sure there are more, and even more after that likely to follow suit. Alcoves are used everywhere, but they're only required in some places. It's just the most, I think, the most intelligent way to remove a drinking fountain or element from the path of travel, and making them more accessible and keeping them out of that path of travel, to protect another class of people that we are going to speak about here in a moment, okay? Now, extending up from our clear ground space that we just spoke about are toe and knee clearances. Okay, so try to think of this clear area as a 3-dimensional space. Okay, just like you see in the illustration. Our toe clearance is 9 inches from the ground to the bottom of the element, and our knee clearance is 27 inches from the ground up. Now, obstructions in this yellow highlighted area are another unfortunately common compliance issue, and I've got a good example of that later. This space underneath has to be clear, and it includes any space between the victim's knees as well. And I get that question here and there. So think P-traps, like drains, hanging phone books, or anything else that you might be able to think of. This space is unusable. You're not allowed to use that space. Okay, so keep that in mind. We are going to open up poll question number 2, please.
Our second poll question today is what, if any, changes in how you see people engage with fountains in the public since COVID? Again, you can select as many that apply to you as possible. The options are no change, drinking fountains are open and used frequently, no access to drinking fountains in public spaces still, bubblers deactivated but access to a bottle filling station, only bottle filling stations available, and touchless drinking fountains and or bottle fillers.
I know I've seen everything in place from caution tape to duct tape to plastic bags to actual devices meant to lock out bubblers. So there's a lot of interesting takes on how to decommission a drinking fountain out there for the moment.
Yeah, it's interesting seeing these answers coming in. We still have quite a few coming in, but the option for no change goes down each and every time we do this webinar since COVID started. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close it up. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, appreciate it. And so moving on, we're going to talk about 307. This pertains to protruding objects, and it is primarily in place to protect another type of protected class that I just mentioned that we haven't touched on yet, and that class is the vision impaired, okay? Elements may only protrude into a walkway so much, and they need to be located at certain heights, whether they are in an alcove or not. Now, this is to prevent anyone from running into those elements in a walkway. Objects and their leading edges or the lowest point on the front of the element above 27 inches may only protrude a maximum of 4 inches into the path of travel, period. And that's to prevent those issues in the walkway. But so long as the leading edge of that element is at or under 27 inches, then this is considered to be detectable by a detection cane. Okay, and I'll walk you through how that is going to work, but that's a very common device for the vision impaired, whether they're being assisted or not. So this is one of my favorite illustrations that I stole, and I like to take credit for. Now on the bottom right, we see an object very similar to a drinking fountain or other object, whatever. And so long as its leading edge, as you can see there, is at or below the 27-inch line, it can be detected through the use of a detection cane, and early enough to be avoided and prevent any potential injury. Now this fountain in any element, so long as it's meeting that 27-inch requirement, can protrude any amount into this space, okay? The same rule applies for elements at or above the 80-inch mark from the floor. This is considered headroom clearance, and similar to previous examples, can extend any amount into the space. So I'm sorry, if you're taller than 6 foot and 8 inches, you may have to detect those things with your forehead. I'm the little guy in my family. My cousins are like 7 feet tall, so that would be they'd be finding some stuff with their forehead. On the left, we have an object sitting above 27 inches, but below the 80 inches I just mentioned. Now, and as such is not above headroom clearance and cannot be detected by a cane, or at least early enough to be to prevent yourself from walking into it, right? Therefore, these objects may not protrude into the space any more than 4 inches, okay? Unless it's a handrail, and there's a specific exception for handrails, but it only gives you an extra ½ inch. So they're allowed to protrude 4.5 inches into the space because it's a device intended to guide you or assist you, etc. So, and the way they're built, it's they're allowed to be 4.5 inches out. Now I'm going to use our 1011 HPS high polish steel, and is what the HPS stands for, and SK3 cane skirt for the next example. This is a dual high-low unit, typically installed in like your high traffic customer facing areas because of that mirror finish, and it's a perfect example of what your typical high-low ADA installation looks like, right? So the SK3 cane skirt is what we need to discuss here. That's what we're going to be focusing on. Now, where drinking fountains can't be alcoved out of the path of travel, a cane skirt must be used to lower the leading edge of that high side fountain down to 27 inches, right? So we just discussed this. We need to make that side of the fountain also detectable by a detection device. Now, when using a detection cane, if unassisted, you are generally following what's referred to as a shoreline, or like outermost edge of a space, since the visually impaired may need to detect something on either side of the room. They may be traveling in either direction, and without the cane skirt in place, there will likely be some incidents, right? Where people will run into the high side fountain. And they'll have a difficult time finding or detecting it since it's much higher than that 27-inch lip of the lower fountain, which is why we use that cane skirt. Many states still don't fully utilize alcoves, and until they do, cane skirts are the answer. Unfortunately, they don't get used as often as they should, but if they're an alcove, you certainly don't have to use one. Section 308. This covers reach ranges. Another important requirement when something like a bottle filler is installed, or when things like baby changing stations are installed. The slide is pretty straightforward. If your reach is unobstructed, like in the photo on the left, you have a 48-inch max and 15-inch minimum reach range, given average human anthropometrics. Now, any buttons, handles, sensors, etc., have to be located within this range. But as soon as we introduce an obstruction, our reach ranges are diminished, okay? When an object shorter than 20 inches is in place, we keep our 48-inch high reach range, but our low reach range disappears since we now have that fountain or another element in place. When reaching over an object that is 20 to 25 inches, our high reach range is shortened to only 44 inches. Generally speaking, fountains are shorter than 20 inches, so the middle example will be basically our reach ranges for the purposes of this webinar. Now remember, we want to make things as easy as possible, not create a challenge for the disabled person, and which is why the drinking fountains don't go that much further out, right? We need them to be able to access potential bottle fillers on the back end of the unit, or if it's a baby changing table, you know, some of them are just pull down, but there's other elements to it. So this could apply to many different things. Here's the breakdown for children. Okay, so remember, children are defined as 12 and under in the ADA. These are all reach ranges that apply to both forward and parallel approach to an element. So starting on the left, ages 3 to 4 have a high-low of 36 to 20 inches. 5 to 8 have 40 to 18 inches, and ages 9 to 12 have a 44 to 16-inch reach. Now, obviously, as they grow, their arm reach grows as well, extending their reach. Ages over 12 are expected to utilize adult height shrinking fountains. The only place you'll typically find these in use, you know, children's heights, is in the school system, daycare facilities, and the like, where many children are supervised by fewer adults. In public, the expectation is that there's an adult there to assist the child to use a fountain or other elements. In chapter 6, we get into the specifics regarding plumbing elements and their measurements. First off, 602.2 covers clear floor space and the necessity to have that clear floor space centered on the unit, not on the alcove. This is very important. I have some examples of installations that missed the mark on this coming up in the presentation. This is for a forward approach, as a parallel approach has to be set up differently. Obviously, our toe and knee clearance must also be available under the unit. There is an exception included here for parallel approaches to children's use units though. Knee and toe clearance begins to diminish pretty quickly as we lower fountains for children's use, especially not your typical fountains, but ones with coolers on the bottom. So it's important to keep that in mind, especially considering that children's use wheelchairs are frequently adult wheelchairs, whether you're aware of that or not. Custom sized wheelchairs can be expensive, and kids grow very quickly. So, and can outgrow their wheelchairs very quickly, which gets expensive. And for some families, that's just not an easy cost to eat. So adult size wheelchairs or whatever you can get your hands on is sometimes just what you gotta use. So a parallel approach helps to solve that issue. Okay. Now here, this is a really good illustration of the floor space and how we need to how it needs to be centered on the elements themselves. So as far as the fountain goes, since the clear floor space is intended for the wheelchair user, it's centered on the left low side fountain. And since there's no real floor space defined in black and white, at least, there is a suggested space for the high side. The floor space can spill over under the high side fountain as much as is needed. Although ideally this fountain is situated outside of the clear floor space. And many make the mistake of centering that clear floor space on the alcove itself, which leads to expensive tearouts, redesigns, and it doesn't make that low side fountain very easily accessible. Now here, we can see we have a total of 48 inches on this alcove wall to wall. It's not deeper than 24 inches, so we don't need to expand on our 30-inch clear floor space. You will, however, notice that it shows a separate measurement for California. And in typical fashion, California strayed from and improved their own requirements and mandated an additional 2 inches of floor space, bumping up the width of the floor space to 32 inches. So long as state requirements, again, go above and beyond the federal standards, they can supersede them. So to center the fountain in the alcove correctly, which is not mandatory, by the way, but is typically done so that it's aesthetically pleasing, right? It would look awkward if you built an alcove and a fountain was shoved up against one wall. To center the fountain in the alcove correctly, we need an additional 48 inches total for the width of the alcove in California and 46 inches total for the alcove anywhere else, right? It's only a couple inches, but it makes a difference when you're in a wheelchair. Now, if the alcove is deeper than 24 inches, remember that we would need a total of 36 inches of ground clearance centered on the low side fountain. Center line to center line, these fountains are separated by 16 inches, which means we would need an additional 18 inches of space on either side total to meet our minimum width and for the fountain to be centered. Since there's no obstructions under the high side fountain, our primary concern is the wall. So remember, if it's at all intruding into our floor space, the alcove would need to be redesigned, or the fountain would need to be shoved over so that the high side fountain is closer to the alcove wall, giving us more room to make the clear floor space that we need for the low side. Okay. And remember, the high side is important too. That, you know, people utilizing the high side fountain may be using walkers, crutches, canes. So we need to leave a reasonable amount of space there so that they can use that fountain as well. And that, Hayden, is going to lead us into poll question number 3.
So the third of our 5 poll questions is, has your facility updated hydration options due to COVID? Again, you can select as many that apply to you. The options are no change. We've deactivated all drinking fountain bubblers. We've added touchless features to all fountains, and we've added bottle filling stations. Thank you again to everybody participating in our poll questions today. All right, we're going to go ahead and wrap this one up as well. Thank you.
I was just speaking at the attendees. There's a lot of you here today. Thank you for attending. Appreciate it. I hope this is useful to you so far and continues to be. So this section, this is an excerpt from the CBC, the California Building Code. And what they've done along with Texas and a few other states is they made it mandatory to locate all drinking fountains in alcoves or within wing walls to ensure they don't impede into pedestrian walkways. Okay, these protected areas have to be 32 inches wide, 18 inches deep minimum. And wing walls are an important way to accomplish that. They act like an alcove where an alcove can't be installed or has to be retrofitted into place. The wing walls also must project horizontally at least as far as the drinking fountain. And while we're on the topic of Chapter 6, I should bring up that the flow of water must also be within compliance for the equipment. The height of the stream of water must be at least 4 inches tall to allow for a bottle or a glass to be filled for those who may be incapable of leaning over the fountain to take a drink. But it also makes it easier to take a drink from the fountain, right? You know what I mean? Luckily for our customers, our valves are built with a front adjustable valve. So all you need is a little flathead screwdriver and we can bump that water flow right up. This is one of my favorite examples. I always think about switching this out, but I can't find a better one than this giant valve, this giant gas line that's underneath the low side fountain. This is an obvious no-no, but that is our clear ground space, and it is very clearly obstructed. Now you can fix this. You could have just swapped these fountains, right? We don't need the clear floor space under the high side fountain. We need it under the low side fountain, and we have that on the left-hand side. As long as it was centered in that area there, I think we'd be just fine. The pipe, valve, whatever that is on the wall on the left, could be an issue, but as long as they measured that clear floor space there between those two valves, that would be easily capable of putting the low side there and using that for compliance. So just swap them, but you can't get a wheelchair under that, obviously. Here is another example. So in this example, we have a high-low situation. There's clear floor space underneath these, but from the center line of the fountain to the wing wall, there wasn't enough space. There's only 14 inches. It doesn't take a lot of space to make something inaccessible or very difficult to access when you're dealing with a wheelchair, right? And if you don't fit, it's not like you can just pop out of it and walk over and get a drink real quick. So it's very important. And they probably designed this alcove to be the correct width, but maybe they didn't account for the tile and so on that got added to it afterwards, decreasing the amount of space and limiting the clear floor space under the low side fountain. So that's an issue, obviously. Okay, let's revisit children's use for a moment. Section 602.2 gives us the maximum bubbler height of 30 inches and a 3.5 inch maximum depth for the bubbler from the front edge of the fountain. Okay, this is really important for access. This also allows us to forego our previously mentioned knee and toe clearance, since we can lower the fountain where the users are intended to be children. Now, there will need to be a parallel approach and space for that available, though. Many states have their own requirements for children's height and approach preference for that, so be sure to reference those local requirements before pulling a Justin said so. Many states still allow for a parallel approach for children fountains, and some require a front approach. So, and even specify their own knee clearance heights. So watch out for that. With that said, let's move on to a few more examples here. Lots wrong with this photo. Their intention was to install a high-low fountain with a third child height fountain in a nice cascading design that would have looked really nice, but it's all mixed up and backwards and terrible. So good looking fountains though, like those fountains. But here's the issue. So firstly, our clear floor space and knee clearance is being obstructed by what was intended to be the child height fountain, okay, on the left. And what should have been done, the ADA fountain, since it has the longer arm, is part of the issue there. So not only is the fountain way too short for our knees and toes to fit underneath, but a wheelchair is going to have trouble maneuvering to the fountain bubbler in the middle there. So while your knees or your wheelchair are hitting the fountain on the left. The high-low combo on the left should have been installed on the right-hand side with the single fountain on the other side. With enough room between it so that the center fountain gets our clear floor space there. And I'll show you how that's done here. So I'm going to use our 1311, 1501 as the example in this because I've got a really great illustration with those. Those are those old cast iron enameled fountains, bulletproof, and typically you're in your school or hospital setting is where you see those guys. And the way that we're going to use these, so I have this illustration here. This is basically the mirror image of the example I just showed you, but compliant. So the 1311 high-low unit is installed on the left and as the standing fountain and a fountain with 22 inches between the center line of the fountain and the ADA fountain and the child height fountain on the right with plenty of room for our clear floor space, okay? So it's bumped out a little further to ensure that it's not encroaching in what is that required 30-inch space below the fountain. Remember, it's a 3-dimensional space, and so long as it's spaced further away, if you want that cascading design, then you're good to go. Now, you could, if you didn't care about the cascading design, throw the child height fountain over on the other side of the standing fountain. It would be totally fine over there. You wouldn't have that nice cascading design, but you could save yourself a lot of space in the design of the alcove if you just move that child height fountain over onto the other side. And then you'd still have plenty of space for your ADA low side fountain as long as it's far enough away from the wall on the right. All right, outdoor fountains. Now let's do, we'll do a few outdoor examples in this. But on our screen, this is the 3300 FRs, a freeze resistant unit, and someone decided to install it way too close to that wall. Now you can see here that our floor space underneath the unit is being obstructed. One might be able to pull off like a hybrid parallel / forward approach, approach to the fountain, but I don't think people need to improvise to get a drink of water. So it needs to be moved away from the wall. Preferably the low side drinking fountain would have been positioned better for people to get access to it and not have to maneuver so in such a difficult way just to get that drink of water there. Here's another example for outdoor compliance. This fountain is, for example, has an adjustable arm. The arm can be adjusted for either like adult ADA or child height. So there's like a little panel, it flips, you can adjust it for either one. These are, for that reason, incredibly common in public parks, especially because of their ability to accommodate both ADA and children when installing these fountains. But you have to pay special attention to the approach and direction of the bubbler head, as this is a really important factor for compliance, okay? Now, each of the following examples are compliant examples. This is how it should be set up. Okay, so we've built these diagrams to explain. Now, above, we have our 3150 installed. The 3150 or any other outdoor fountain is installed if it's installed against a wall, building, railing structure, whatever it is. The center line of the wheelchair accessible fountain needs to be a minimum of 15 inches away from the wall to give us our 30 inches of clear ground space, right? And we'll of course need 48 inches out from the base of the fountain to take advantage of that. So same as indoor installations, we need to have our available knee and toe clearance available underneath the fountain as well. Lastly, I mentioned this earlier in the presentation, but on the bottom middle there of our visual representation of the clear floor space, we have our 30 by 30 inches. Now, I only hinted at this earlier, but there is a generally agreed upon space necessary for accessibility for those with stooping and bending disabilities. Again, that might be using a walker or cane, etc. So having that clear floor space and having it, you know, accessible, easily accessible is also important, okay? In the next example, common practice in public parks is typically to pour a pad of concrete specifically for the fountain to help remove the fountain from the pedestrian walkway and give users obviously a firm surface to stand on. And in this example, you can clearly see the path of travel on the left side, which will provide easy access to the low side fountain. If the orientation of the fountain were in any different in this exact layout, access to the fountain would be very difficult. So to fit a fountain perfectly here, to include both the wheelchair-free ground space and the high side fountain space that we talked about, we need a pad that is 69 by 52 inches deep and wide, with the low side again facing the path of travel for an easy approach. Slightly different example, but with the wing walls that I discussed, or guardrails, they're also called in place. All requirements remain the same here for the approach, still favoring a forward approach since it's the easiest. Unfortunately, many installations prioritize that high side drinking fountain, and I like to think unintentionally, but it makes the low side difficult to access. Remember that the guardrails need to extend at least far enough out so that no part of the fountain protrudes outside of the reach of the rails. This is all in an effort to make the unit more accessible and detectable as well. This is just a short lineup. You got some of the above models they're all compliant ADA installation units. So we also have the ability to run specials to fit, you know, unique situations and areas with our fountains. So if you have something unusual, our specials department is bananas. They're super good at coming up with solutions, and there is a solution for everything in every situation. And I'm betting we could help you find it. So be sure to keep that in mind. But I love this slide because it's just such a nice lineup of our outdoor units there. For those who may not be aware, the 2010 ADA standards for accessible design was derived from an ANSI standard, A117.1-2009. That's for you to look up. The updates that these standards last received included the addition of bottle filling stations to the drinking fountain section 602, as you see on the screen here. So remember this, in addition, a bottle filler does not replace a drinking fountain, ever. Unless you have exceeded your quota for the number of drinking fountains in your building and can then replace one of them with a bottle filler. 602.4 indicates that bottle fillers must adhere to all the other rules, reach ranges, etc. For one, and period. Two, regarding clear floor space, which again is 30 by 48 inches. And that the controls need to be either hand operated or automatic. And it needs to be within our reach ranges, okay? I'll go over that in a moment here. I'll show you some examples. There is also an exception on this page stating that if the bottle filler is installed on both the high and low side fountains, then the high side does not need to comply with this section, which is due to the fact that we have an accessible low side bottle filler already installed, okay? Which is kind of rare. You usually see one on one side or the other, typically, and almost most commonly, it's the low side so that it's accessible. But if you have both, that's totally fine too. Next, I'm going to use our 1920 bottle fillers for the next examples. For compliance, these little devices are retrofittable bottle fillers for either our equipment, competitors' equipment, wherever they're nice stainless steel or colored, and make for easy ADA compliance and upgrades and stuff. And they got those nice new hands-off sensors on them too. This is the 1117 LN HO2 with that 1920 bottle filler over the low side fountain, accessible to everybody, well within reach ranges. All we need to ensure here is that the touchless button on the front there is reachable, and the activator is either hand operated or automatic. In this case, it's automatic. And even with all this said, I'm sure the standard will change eventually. We could all still do a much better job. You know, it's easy for us. We need to make sure it's easy for everybody else too. Now, in accordance with 308.2.2, the bottle filler is located at 46 inches, which is below our required 48-inch reach range, which we covered earlier. Remember, this is a maximum height, and since it is a maximum height, the activator can be located anywhere between the fountain and the bottle filler. Anywhere in that area is totally fine, just not below the fountain since we have the obstruction in place. Now, if there was no fountain installed or no obstruction under the bottle filler, we can install the activator as low as 15 inches, technically. We definitely don't need to do that based on our reach ranges, but that would also be, it would be pretty impractical. Remember that we get 48 inches reach here because the installed fountain is not exceeding 20 inches from the wall. Most fountains are about 18 to 20 inches. So if an element was in place that fell into the 20 to 25 inch reach range, which is pretty rare, then our reach range would go down to 44 inches instead. Here is an example that we found in public. This is an Oasis setup, and it looks like they installed the high-low fountain, and then at a later date and time they decided, oh, we want to add a bottle filler, and unfortunately didn't retrofit the drinking fountain in a way to include the bottle filler at within reach ranges. So it's on the correct side at least, but it's way above our reach range area there. Even just reaching that platform to place your bottle in is difficult. So this is way out of compliance. It needs to be corrected. Another common installation model, 1501. This one mostly popular with schools due to that white, enamel surface, which is actually intended to stay cooler in direct sunlight, if you didn't know, rather than stainless steel, heating up and potentially burning anybody. The white enamel's really nice for outdoor situations. So let me show you what compliance looks like with that here in a minute. I've got a example coming up. This has the accessible bottle filler above it. This is just a ADA example. This would be something that you would see in that like children's environment, schools, daycares, etc. If you had a compliant setup with a bottle filler, they also have to meet the same guidelines for child height reach ranges if you're going to have a fountain installed, and of course it has to be installed at child height for the fountain and meet all the requirements for the bubbler as well. Now, speaking of child height, remember children are defined as age 12 or under. Here we're utilizing the age range of 9 to 12. So our maximum reach range would be 44 inches. The bubbler head has to be a maximum of 30 inches or below for the child height fountain at the spout, not at the top of the bubbler head, at the spout where the water comes out. As you can see on the screen, our bottle filler activation is at 42 5/8 inches from the floor, which is below our 44-inch max, and the bubbler is at 30 inches, well within compliance. This would not do in an adult situation unless raised, obviously. It wouldn't meet adult ADA guidelines, since the fountain would be an obstruction to our knee and toe clearance, and the bottle filler would be in the wrong position and would need to be raised. Okay, we're going to get into our fourth poll question here in a second. I like to end the kind of meat of the presentation with this particular photo. This is installed in our local airport, and it's just a beautiful ADA installation, and I really like it. I like to show it off because it's right in our backyard. But we're going to get into the FAQ and the Q&A. Hayden has some information that he's going to share with you real quick before we get into that, though. So it's just, I think, just 2 slides and our 2 poll questions. I bet he's on mute. He has no idea right now.
Oh, I was. Man, you know me. Thank you. So our fourth and second to last poll question is, what percentage of time do you specify a bottle filler when specifying your drinking fountain? If this does not apply to you, you do not need to answer it as well.
Happens to the best of us, Hayden. I started a webinar like that once. It's like 30 seconds of mute awkwardness.
I believe I even told you before the webinar that was a possibility I'd do that today.
I think you did, yeah.
All right, we're going to give it a few more seconds and I'll close this poll question up. We still have some answers coming in though. All right, thank you everyone. So now we'll get into our new hygienic and accessible options. Haas really took initiative to provide these new options after the past 2 years of constant change that we've seen. These new options include our new touchless electric sensors and antimicrobial surfaces. And these items provide sanitary activation options to enhance hygienic hydration in public places. These can also be added to our new and existing units with easy to follow instructions for quick installation out in the field. On the left here, you'll see 2 of our newer units in our electric water cooler collection. These units with bubblers have antimicrobial bubbler heads, and these are ADA compliant and have several smart features. The most common smart feature in these, which everybody wants to see nowadays, is that bottle saved counter. This unit also has forward-thinking energy efficiency. It gives you the ability to track the filter life. It has a purge feature to prevent Legionella. You can calibrate the touchless sensor on the unit, And it also has a display code for any error codes just to simplify the troubleshooting process. These units are easy to install and retrofit, including over other manufacturers' equipment, because they have plenty of room inside the unit, and that provides adjustability to fit over previously plumbed and powered units. They also come with a self-leveling wall mount and a installation template, making it that much easier too. That installation template is definitely helping me. Then in the middle, you'll see our newer standalone bottle fillers. These options are really ideal for all types of high traffic areas, and they can be used in indoor and outdoor use. They're constructed of durable stainless steel materials to make them vandal resistant and resist any stains or corrosion they're going to get in that outdoor use too. And they are also ADA compliant, I should say. And then our hands-free sensors and antimicrobial copper push buttons are on the right. These are, again, offered for available new units and for existing units as retrofit kits. And to start off with the copper, copper has really become broadly recognized for its antimicrobial properties among many industries over the past several years. And our copper push buttons offer a simple process to immediately provide added protection to our HAWS unit. And then those hands-free sensors, they can convert most HAWS standard push button units to have touchless hands-free operation with just a front motion in front of them. And these sanitary activation options really are a quick and easy install with easy to follow instructions, like I said earlier. Go on to poll question number 5 here, our final poll question and probably the hardest. Would you be interested in learning more about the HAWS touchless hydration products? I want to thank everybody for participating in our poll questions today. We got a lot of responses for the attendees that we have here today.
Yeah, it's hugely appreciated. And so what we're going to do is that's the meat of our presentation, which takes about that whole hour. If you'd like to stick around, we'd love for you to stick around. Hayden is going to answer 2 of our FAQs, and then we're going to pick a handful of the questions that were submitted during the webinar, and I'm going to answer those personally. So we're going to go ahead and stay on. We're going to go over the FAQ and the Q&A, and then we have a slide with our contact information and some other useful resources. And we'll of course be following up with the follow-up email with additional resources, CU, credit information, and stuff like that too. So if you want to stick around, we'd love for you to stick around. We're going to cover the questions right now.
So our FAQ questions, the first one is, does everything have to be ADA accessible? No, not everything needs to be ADA accessible, but you are going to need to ask yourself if your building or business has places designed for public accommodation. This can be a lot of different areas, from your retail stores to restaurants, airports, schools, so many different options. And if your answer to that question is yes, then you're going to need to ensure that you have accessible routes and the elements of the building are also accessible. Remember that those private businesses are also responsible as long as they have the 15 or more employees that are required. And that kind of depends on the state that you're in. There are, of course, areas in the different businesses you could have. And depending on the facility, you may not need wheelchair access, and you should actually detour wheelchair access, such as you're not going to need wheelchair access to the cooling tower at your local power plant. Just remember to think where you have given the access to and make the appropriate changes moving forward. Our second FAQ is, are children's height fixtures required by the ADA? Yes, they are required by the ADA, and that does not just pertain to the fountains that we've been talking about today. You got to think about the customers that are being talked about in this question. It's going to be mainly your daycares, your schools and facilities that have mostly children in them, and they need to have accessible toilets and sinks just along with fountains and the other options. These requirements are not always the easiest to follow in the ADA, but they are required, and we're hoping that future iterations of the ADA standard will provide better information on this. To go back to the question though, yes, they are generally required where assistance from an adult is not available. We assume in public areas you're going to have a parent to rely on, so it's nice to have those child height fountains in the areas, but it isn't always required. And that's why you're not going to see like a child-sized toilet in a public space very common. Then we'll move on to the Q&A here. The first question we have for you, Justin, is do I have to have a bottle filler installed?
Nope. Moving on. No, bottle fillers are optional. They're a very popular option. Not everyone carries a bottle or a cup with them, so drinking fountains are required. Bottle fillers are optional. So they were typically installed after construction, more of a user preference, but nowadays we see bottle fillers being more spec driven than ever before. So more projects include 1 or 2 bottle fillers now, or on all fountains. It just depends on what the project is, what the building is, and what their needs are.
All right, our next question is, I never see cane skirts installed. Why not, and could facilities get in trouble for not using them?
That's a good question. So enforcement or just good old-fashioned ignorance to their necessity could be the issue. Not sure how many webinars are out there pushing cane skirt necessity these days. At least one that we know of, right? And if you don't know something is incorrect, you can't fix it. But these are important devices. They may not even be used, but it's our responsibility to make sure this world is as navigable as possible for everyone. The facility, whatever it is, airport, school, so on, could absolutely get into some trouble for not having them installed, assuming the fountain is in the path of travel, not alcoved. It just takes someone to know better and to contact the Department of Justice. And you can actually do that. You can visit www.ada.com, and they have a full outline of how to file a complaint, who to file it with. Just be sure to take photos. Photos don't lie. They're usually the best evidence.
The third question we have is, do safety showers and eye washes have to meet the ADA?
Yeah, of course. So that's the other half of our business here at Haas, which you probably knew typing this up. But we do eye washes, safety showers, combos, all that type of safety stuff. And they have to meet most of the same measurements and requirements we just covered. You just need to think about, is this equipment located in an accessible area, and will someone confined to a wheelchair or someone whose mobility is challenged need to access emergency first aid equipment, right? If the answer is yes, then install ADA compliant equipment. They exist, we sell them. They should be installed much more frequently than they are, mostly in our education systems, high school, university level. Labs are not devoid of wheelchair confined people. So in those situations, it would be important to have ADA accessible emergency equipment.
Our fourth and final question is, I work in a historically preserved building. Do we need to meet ADA standards?
Yes, so that's an interesting one, and one that comes up a lot. Historic buildings have to be just as accessible as non-historic buildings. Given that it is a historic building, it's fair to assume it wasn't designed or built in as an accessible building. But, and it's a big but, where you think it may not be possible to make an area accessible without damaging or threatening the site's significance, there is a built-in consultation process that's outlined in the ADA. So you'll need to contact the SHPO, that's the State Historic Preservation Officer, to help determine whether it can or should be done. Okay. And second, but access to historic properties open to the public is a civil right. Okay, citizens should be able to explore and enjoy our nation's history and heritage freely, and owners or operators have to make them as accessible as possible. So unless it's been you've contacted that SHPO, they do need to be as accessible. So with that, we're gonna end the questions there. We'll put this in a full report, Excel spreadsheet. We'll share this with all of you. We greatly appreciate your attendance. Okay, but that is it for the webinar. Thank you everyone for attending. We appreciate almost all of you stuck around for the questions. So I hope those were helpful. We will get those out to you. We appreciate all of your support. The follow-up email will be sent out soon with the questions, of course, additional tools, CEU credit instructions. Be sure to utilize the contact information on the page if you have questions. The dates for the next webinar are going to be, we'll have a February ANSI webinar, and then the next ADA webinar will be in April, I believe. So take what you've learned today, go forth, share this information, be champions for compliance. Also be sure to utilize www.hosco.com. We have a live chat function on there that is awesome, puts you in direct communication with our customer service team, who are amazing. If you need anything at all, thank you, and enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you, everyone.